Just run appropriate Google searches, you'll find the truth. So a couple of women just walked past my chalk slogan, and one of them said, "Wow, looking at that one. Unitarians cover up and deny clergy sexual abuse of children." An entirely truthful statement, which is supported by plenty of evidence. Not the least of that evidence being the brazen, bald-faced lies that UUA moderator Jim Key told about Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual abuse of children in what was supposed to be a second UUA apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct. Just over a year ago, on June, I think 27th, might have been 28th, of 2014, UUA moderator Jim Key stood up in front of thousands of Unitarian Universalist delegates at the Unitarian Universalist Association's General Assembly at Providence, Rhode Island. And in the middle of his first moderator's report to a Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, he delivered what was supposed to be a second UUA apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct, because the first apology turned out to be not worth the breath it was spoken with. Unfortunately, the second apology that UUA moderator Jim Key delivered last year is also not worth the breath it was spoken with. And unlike the first apology, which to the very best of my knowledge did not contain any outright lies. Just wait for the truck to pass here. The so-called apology that UUA moderator Jim Key delivered tried to minimize the amount of clergy sexual misconduct in general by saying that only a small number of Unitarian Universalist ministers were guilty of clergy sexual misconduct. In fact, no less than 400 Unitarian Universalist churches have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another, and it's most likely that it's more like 2/3 or so. The Unitarian Universalist ministers who did a serious count of exactly which Unitarian Universalist churches had been affected by clergy sexual misconduct stopped counting when they reached 400. I guess they just got tired of counting and maybe didn't want to know how many more Unitarian Universalist congregations had been affected by clergy sexual misconduct. I guess they figured, well, yeah, we know 400 have been, that's plenty. It should be noted that there's only about 1,000 Unitarian Universalist churches in the United States. So that means that somewhere between 40% and 60+% of Unitarian Universalist congregations have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct. But that wasn't the worst lie that Jim Key told. No, he went on to say, and I believe this is an exact quote, or very, very close to an exact quote. He went on to say, no children or elders, there were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations. So one more time, there were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations. So what's he claiming there? Well, that can be interpreted in various ways. It could be interpreted as Jim Key saying, well, while I was investigating clergy sexual misconduct, I didn't abuse any elders or children. That's one way of looking at it, but I don't think that's what he was trying to tell Unitarian Universalists at the UUA-GA last year. No, I think we can reasonably interpret Jim Key's words as meaning that in his investigations of clergy sexual misconduct, he found no evidence of any clergy sexual abuse of children or elders. That's what he's saying. Unfortunately, I personally told Jim Key about cases of abuse of children which included rape of children, which also included, you know, clergy sexual abuse of children that resulted in jail terms for the clergy ministers who were found guilty of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. I really don't know why you think those chalk slogans are funny, because they're totally truthful and do not reflect well on your church. They're not? There's no evidence? Are you insane, sir? I suggest you do some research. There's no evidence? You are insane. You are actually, it's actually more commonly known as psychological denial. If you claim that there's no evidence to support my chalk slogans, you are in complete psychological denial, sir. So that's a member of the Unitarian Church of Montreal who was like shaking his head at this chalk slogan. We'll just go have another look at it, because we want to see exactly what he was saying there was no evidence of. So he's saying that there's no evidence that Unitarians misuse Canada's blasphemy law to cover up pedophilia and rape. Well, that's strange, because on Friday, June 1st of 2012, I received an email from Stikeman Elliott Barristers and Solicitors litigation lawyer Maitre Marc-André Coulombe, which referred me to a PDF attachment which was attached to that email. And in that PDF attachment, which was essentially an electronic version of a paper and ink letter that he had drafted, Maitre Marc-André Coulombe of Stikeman Elliott Barristers and Solicitors, acting on behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, accused me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel for allegedly, and I do say allegedly, making unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. So, Maitre Marc-André Coulombe was saying that, you know, I had made unfounded, that is false, allegations about Unitarian Universalist ministers committing such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, and that if I did not take down the blog posts about these Unitarian Universalist ministers, that, you know, he could and would, you know, move to have me charged with the criminal act of blasphemous libel for blaspheming against the Unitarian Universalist religious community. Well, guess what? That was more than 3 years ago. We're talking June 1st of 2012. It is now August 16th of 2015. 3 years have gone by, and guess what? I have not been charged with the criminal act of blasphemous libel. And anyone who wants to see that letter can just go on the internet and read it. I posted the letter to the internet very soon after Maitre Marc-André Coulombe made that accusation, you know, for his client, the Unitarian Universalist Association. So there's really no question that the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston attempted to misuse Canada's blasphemy law in Bill Cosby-style legal bullying that was obviously intended to cover up such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by certain Unitarian Universalist ministers. Now, the evidence is there, there's loads of evidence, and yet this member of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, who's been aware of my protest for as long as it's been going on, and as long as he's been a member, is trying to pretend that there's no evidence supporting these chalk slogans. Well, no, actually it's the other way around. There's no evidence supporting the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations false accusation to the effect that I'm guilty of the criminal act of blasphemous libel for allegedly making unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crime as pedophilia and rape. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence that certain Unitarian Universalist ministers have not only committed such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, but some of them have actually been charged, tried, and convicted of such despicable crimes and sentenced to jail terms for committing them. Which brings us to this chalk slogan here, which I was talking about. Unitarians cover up and deny clergy sexual abuse of children. Well, the aforementioned blasphemous libel accusation is one way in which Unitarians cover up and deny clergy sexual abuse of children. But then there's the Jim Key's apology, which essentially pretended that no children have been sexually abused by clergy ministers, Unitarian Universalist clergy to his knowledge at all, in spite of his investigations. This is, again, a brazen, bald-faced lies, because in my efforts to try to persuade Jim Key that it was in the best interests of the Unitarian Universalist Association to formally withdraw its false, blasphemous libel accusation against me, and to apologize for bringing it against me, and to tell the truth about Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual abuse of children, I told Jim Key about the Reverend Mac Mitchell case, in which Reverend Mac Mitchell lured vulnerable teenage Tibetan refugees away from their families in India with promises of a better life in America, and proceeded to repeatedly rape them over a period measured in years, until one of them finally had enough and reported the rapes, and he was charged, tried, and convicted of such despicable crimes as rape anyway, and some other related charges. Wasn't exactly pedophilia, because the girls were teenagers, not preteens. But you know, there have been preteen children who have been sexually molested by Unitarian Universalist ministers, and some of those ministers have been charged, tried, and convicted of sexual abuse of children and sentenced to jail terms for their sexual abuse of children. So the evidence is there. This Unitarian who tries to pretend that there's no evidence to support my slogans here is in complete denial. You know, either that or he's lying. I mean, he might really believe that there's no evidence, in which case he's in psychological denial, or he might know perfectly well that the evidence exists, but he's lying in an effort to you know, cover up the fact. So that's that for now. We're going to walk back and forth with our picket signs here a bit, but every single picket sign and chalked slogan that I put up here is carefully vetted for truthfulness, because, you know, I'm not particularly interested in being successfully sued for libel or something. You know, I try to be very careful about not only telling the truth, but being quite accurate in telling the truth and having evidence to support what I'm saying, so that I can avoid, you know, false, or I should say can avoid, you know, libel accusations and so on, or at least successfully defend myself against them if anyone actually you know, tries to sue me. And speaking of such things, Sue Montgomery, a member of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, who has been actively involved in trying to shut down my protest here in various ways, again with false accusations, you know, paranoid fantasies, perjurious lies, and so on, along with other members of the church, repeatedly calling the SPVM to try and shut down my protest, and telling them all kinds of stories about me, you know, blocking access to the church and stuff like that, which I've never done. Sue Montgomery was the Montreal Gazette's justice reporter. And even before being accused of blasphemous libel, I said to Sue, hey Sue, you know, you should really do a story about this justice issue here in front of your church, you know. So even before I was accused of blasphemous libel, I was saying to Sue, well, you know, in your capacity as the Montreal Gazette's justice reporter, maybe you should report, you know, on what's going on here at the Unitarian Church of Montreal. Of course, you know, being a Unitarian, you know, she didn't particularly want to do a story that didn't reflect well on her church, so of course she didn't. So when I was accused of blasphemous libel, sometime later I ran into Sue at a vigil for women victims of violence, and saw her, and, you know, she was doing her report about, you know, violence against women and so on. So I said to Sue at that time, hey, guess what, Sue? You know, your religious community has now accused me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel in efforts to, you know, cover up and hide such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. You know, I think that's a pretty good justice issue story. You know, you should cover that story. And again, you know, she didn't, of course. You know, Sue being a Montreal Unitarian, last thing she wanted to do was expose the fact that her religious community is actually guilty, not the Unitarian Church of Montreal, but the larger Unitarian Universalist community, is guilty of falsely accusing me of blasphemous libel in an effort to cover up pedophilia and rape committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers. So, of course, Sue refused to do the story. When I called the Gazette City desk, several times to try to get them to do the story, well, they had all kinds of lame excuses for not doing the story. And I think I can reasonably surmise that Sue Montgomery might have wielded her influence within the Gazette to ensure that they did not report that story about Unitarian Universalist misuse of Canada's blasphemy law to cover up and deny pedophilia and rape. So we're looking at 2012, 2013, even early 2014. I made a concerted effort to get this story told in mainstream news media in January of 2014. I called the Gazette City desk several times in January of 2014, and of course, as I said, they had these lame excuses for not doing the story. Well, then all of a sudden in the fall of 2014, Sue Montgomery comes out as claiming to be a rape victim, claiming to have been raped by her grandfather, claiming to have been raped by a work colleague at Air Canada, and basically coming out about why women don't report rape. She came up with this "being raped never reported" hashtag, and all of a sudden, Sue Montgomery's the champion of women who've been raped. Sue's the great emancipator and so on. Well, obviously, from my perspective, I didn't see Sue Montgomery as being a big hero. I saw Sue Montgomery as being a big two-faced hypocrite, and so I protested and so on. Well, I'm going to wrap this up because we're coming to the end of the segment of tape. But essentially, I've been protesting Sue Montgomery's complicity in Unitarian Universalist cover-up of clergy abuse, including pedophilia and rape.